Somehow the mountains have always had a very strong hold on me, and from the first time that I visited Aspen, which was when I was courting Annie.
By 1997, the world thought it knew John Denver completely. The gentle voice behind Rocky Mountain High and Take Me Home,
of their children never lived past the age of 6 because of this.
Country Roads. But for 28 years, he'd quietly kept two versions of himself apart. The wholesome icon fans adored, and a private reality that told a very different story. Legal trouble. A marriage falling apart. A truth that wouldn't come into focus until long after he was gone. What finally connects those two sides of him explains far more than anyone expected, and why it took this long to come out. The unexpected beginning of John Denver. On paper, John Denver had a pretty typical family setup: a mother, a father, and a younger brother. But his father's stable career in the U.S. Air Force meant that stability was often the last thing Denver experienced as a child. His family moved from place to place, forcing him to constantly start over in new towns and new schools. But the constant moving wasn't the hardest part. As Denver got older, he would admit that his father struggled to show affection to either of his sons. The household was strict, rigid, and heavily controlled. As the oldest son, Denver gradually withdrew into himself. By his junior year of high school, he had reached his limit. In a desperate attempt to break free, Denver stole his father's car and drove all the way to California. He had relatives there, but he also had something else on his mind: music. He had started playing guitar and was beginning to imagine a future as a professional musician. That escape didn't last long. His father flew to California, tracked him down, and brought him right back home. Denver reluctantly returned and finished school, but the experience made one thing clear: his father wasn't going to keep him under control forever. By 1963, Denver made his move for good. He dropped out of college and relocated to Los Angeles. This time, there was no going back. He started from the ground up, booking his own gigs and performing wherever he could. Slowly, he began building a reputation around the local music scene. Then came the opportunity that finally put him on a bigger stage. Denver joined the folk group, the New Christie Minstrels. He was a natural performer, but there was one immediate problem: his name. The man the world would eventually know as John Denver had actually been born John Deutschendorf Jr., and while that was perfectly fine as a family name, it wasn't exactly ideal for a performer trying to fit his name onto a theater marquee. Denver reportedly resisted the idea of changing it. But the group had a practical problem. Deutschendorf was simply too long. The name Denver came from a song the group was working on, and eventually, it stuck. That small change turned out to be the beginning of a much bigger transformation. Denver continued performing with the group, but his career was about to take another unexpected turn. Just 2 years after moving to California, he joined the Chad Mitchell Trio, a folk group known for satirical songs that took aim at conservative politics, organizations, and public figures. It was a very different environment from the wholesome image Denver would eventually become famous for. But the group gave him something far more important than another job in music. It introduced him to Annie Martel. During a trio concert at a university in Minnesota in the mid-1960s, Denver noticed Martel, a college sophomore, in the audience. There were no social media messages or dating apps to make the introduction easy. Instead, Denver had to rely on some old-fashioned detective work. The two didn't even speak that night. But about 3 weeks later, Martel received a letter from Denver. He asked if they could meet and talk when he returned to Minnesota. Whatever was written in that letter, it worked. When Denver eventually returned, he called Martel, and the two quickly became close. Their relationship moved incredibly fast. Within about a year, they were married, both still barely into their 20s. Now Denver had a wife by his side, but his ambitions were only getting bigger. He continued working with the Chad Mitchell Trio, while increasingly feeling that the group wasn't where his future belonged. He wanted to write his own songs, so he started doing exactly that. In 1967, Denver put together an album of his own material. There was just one problem. He didn't have a record label willing to release it. So he improvised. Instead of letting the album sit on a shelf, Denver mailed copies to family and friends as Christmas gifts. It was hardly the traditional path to stardom, but it showed just how determined he was to get his own music heard. And that album arrived at a complicated moment in both Denver's life and American history. The United States was deep into the Vietnam War, and in 1968, the conflict became painfully personal. Denver's younger brother was deployed overseas, but Denver wasn't there to see him leave. While his brother was being sent into a war zone, Denver was performing at a peace concert. It was another sign that his life was moving in a very different direction from the one his family might have expected. He was no longer simply trying to escape his father's control. He was beginning to build a life entirely on his own terms. The beginning of Denver's hidden struggle. 2 years into his marriage, Denver decided it was finally time to step out on his own. He left the band, started taking solo gigs, and threw himself into finding management and securing a real record deal. Then, almost by chance, one of the songs from his self-produced album landed in front of the right people. That song was Leaving on a Jet Plane. By the end of the 1960s, it had climbed all the way to the top of the charts. It sounded like the kind of breakthrough that should have opened every door. Instead, Denver still had to fight for a place in the industry. He and his producer, Milt Okun, spent months trying to convince record labels to take a chance on him. The problem was that rock music was dominating the scene, and Denver didn't look or sound like the stars record executives were chasing. He was a quiet, clean-cut singer-songwriter in an industry increasingly obsessed with rock and roll. Eventually, one label took the risk. In 1969, RCA Records signed Denver and released his first major label album, Rhymes and Reasons. It included Leaving on a Jet Plane, along with several of his own songs. But getting a record contract didn't suddenly make Denver a star. If anything, the real work was just beginning. With limited support from the label, Denver practically became his own promotional team. He organized a tour through the Midwest, performing at local venues wherever he could get a stage. He put up his own posters, arranged his own radio appearances, and went from town to town trying to convince people to listen to his music. It was a grind, but it worked. Little by little, Denver built something more valuable than a quick hit: a loyal audience. Then, in 1971, everything changed. Denver released Poems, Prayers, and Promises, and one song in particular exploded. Take Me Home. Country Roads climbed the charts and introduced Denver to an audience far beyond the folk scene. He carried that momentum into his next album, Rocky Mountain High. The title track became another major hit, but this time, success came with controversy attached. The song was a peaceful celebration of nature, Colorado, and the feeling of being surrounded by the mountains. But some critics became convinced that the phrase Rocky Mountain High was a hidden reference to drug use. In the early 1970s, that accusation was enough to cause serious problems. Several major radio stations refused to play the song. Yet the controversy couldn't stop it. Rocky Mountain High became one of Denver's signature songs, even as parts of the traditional country establishment remained unsure about where he fit. That tension became impossible to ignore at the 1975 Country Music Association Awards. Denver won Entertainer of the Year, and Charlie Rich had the job of presenting him with the award. But before handing over the envelope, Rich pulled out a lighter and set it on fire on live television. Many interpreted the bizarre moment as a protest against Denver's victory. To some traditional country figures, Denver simply didn't look or sound enough like a traditional country artist. But while the industry argued over where Denver belonged, his biggest battle was happening far away from the stage. Behind the fame, Denver and his young wife were struggling to hold their marriage together. They were still a young couple dealing with the same arguments and pressures as anyone else, except their problems were happening under the weight of Denver's rapidly growing fame. And after one particularly heated argument in the mid-1970s, something remarkable came out of the aftermath. Denver wrote what would become one of his most famous songs, Annie's Song. The story goes that he wrote it in roughly 10 minutes while riding a ski lift, drawing inspiration from his emotions after reconciling with Annie. The result was a deeply romantic song that would go on to become one of his biggest hits. But there was an uncomfortable truth underneath the romance. Denver and Annie Martel had serious problems that couldn't be fixed by one beautiful song. Their journey to becoming parents had already been difficult. After years of trying to have children naturally, they eventually turned to adoption. In the mid-1970s, they welcomed a son and a daughter into their family. From the outside, they seemed to have everything: a successful career, 2 children, and a growing family. But fame had created cracks in the marriage that children couldn't simply make disappear. By 1979, Martel was openly discussing how difficult Denver's fame had become for her. She struggled with the attention surrounding her husband and admitted that his celebrity had left her feeling deeply insecure. Denver eventually acknowledged his own role in the breakdown. His relentless schedule kept him constantly on the road, and the more successful he became, the less time he seemed to have for the people closest to him. Eventually, the pressure became too much. At one point, Denver reached his limit and disappeared to Switzerland for nearly a week. It was only 6 days, but for Martel, the separation felt much longer. She later described spending her days overwhelmed by emotion, waking before dawn and crying until she finally went to sleep. And yet, somehow, even that wasn't the end. After an emotional phone call from Annie, Denver decided to come home. Their marriage had survived another crisis, but the problems between them were far from over. And as Denver's personal life continued to unravel, another struggle was quietly beginning to consume him. When John Denver hit rock bottom. While rock music was dominating the charts, John Denver's gentle, folksy sound made him an easy target for critics. His fans remained fiercely loyal, but the constant criticism still got under his skin. Some reporters went as far as calling him the Mickey Mouse of rock, and those kinds of attacks clearly took a toll on his confidence. Looking for answers, Denver eventually turned to an unexpected source, a controversial self-help program called Erhard Seminars Training, better known as EST. The program promised to transform people's lives through intense, hours-long sessions. Some saw it as a serious form of personal growth, while others dismissed it as another strange trend from the 1970s. But no seminar could prepare Denver for the losses that were waiting for him. Behind the success, he was dealing with personal problems that he rarely discussed publicly. Years later, in his autobiography, Denver finally opened up about some of the darker parts of his marriage. He admitted that he had been unfaithful and acknowledged that his relationship with Annie Martel had sometimes become physically aggressive. After more than a decade together, the marriage finally reached its breaking point. In 1982, Martel filed for divorce. The exact details of what happened inside their home during those final years remain complicated, but Denver clearly struggled to accept the end of the relationship. When the two later met to divide their belongings, the situation reportedly became frightening. Despite the peaceful image Denver had built throughout his career, he allegedly became aggressive toward Martel during the meeting. According to reports, he even tried to choke her. Then came an incident that sounds almost unbelievable. Denver arrived at the property division meeting carrying a chainsaw. Thankfully, he didn't use it against Martel. Instead, he reportedly used it to cut their marital bed in half, so they could each have a piece. It was a bizarre and deeply disturbing moment, and it raised uncomfortable questions about what their marriage had really been like behind closed doors. But that was only one part of what became an absolutely brutal year for Denver. In 1982, his father died unexpectedly. Their relationship had been difficult during Denver's childhood, but the two had eventually grown much closer. In fact, his father became an important part of Denver's life later on, even teaching him how to fly. Aviation became something they could share, giving them a bond that had been missing when Denver was young. Now that relationship was gone too. His marriage was over. His father had died. And before the year was finished, Denver made another major decision. This time, he chose to end the relationship himself. He cut ties with his longtime manager, Jerry Weintraub. Weintraub reportedly took the decision badly and responded with an outrageous accusation, calling Denver a Nazi. Considering Denver's long public history of promoting peace, environmental causes, and humanitarian work, the accusation was particularly shocking. Yet even as his personal life seemed to be falling apart, Denver didn't abandon the causes he cared about. He remained deeply committed to peace and environmental protection. He supported charities, humanitarian campaigns, and organizations around the world. His work earned him plenty of recognition, but there was one major event where his reputation apparently wasn't enough to get him through the door. In 1985, some of the biggest names in music came together to record "We Are the World," a massive charity project created to raise money for famine relief in Africa. Given Denver's history of humanitarian work, he expected to be included. He wasn't. By then, his commercial popularity had started to decline, and some of the people involved reportedly believed that adding Denver would weaken the song's impact. The rejection hurt badly. Then Willie Nelson reportedly made a joke at Denver's expense, suggesting that if a bomb hit the building where the recording was taking place, Denver would suddenly become #1 again. The room laughed. Even major stars like Michael Jackson and Kenny Rogers joined in. For Denver, it wasn't funny. He later admitted that being left out broke his heart. With his music career losing some of its momentum, Denver began looking toward another lifelong passion: space exploration. He had always been fascinated by NASA and the idea of human beings reaching beyond Earth. So in 1985, he actually began training with the hope of one day traveling into space. But once again, fate had other plans. In January 1986, the Challenger space shuttle broke apart shortly after launch, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. For Denver, the tragedy was personal in another way. His dream of going into space was effectively over. As he had done throughout his life, he turned to music to process what had happened. He wrote "Flying for Me" as a tribute to the astronauts who lost their lives. Meanwhile, his career on Earth was struggling. After years of major hits and appearances across music, film, and television, Denver's commercial power was fading. In 1986, RCA Records dropped him from the label. The decision reportedly had less to do with his talent and more to do with changes in the company's leadership. Whatever the reason, Denver kept performing, and before long, his attention turned back toward romance. While traveling in Australia, Denver met actress and singer Cassandra Delaney. According to Delaney, the attraction was immediate. The funny part was that she didn't even realize she was looking at a major international star. She reportedly had to ask someone who he was. At first, she assumed a man as famous as Denver would never be interested in her. But she introduced herself anyway, and the relationship moved incredibly quickly. They married in 1988. Delaney became involved in Denver's life, including his music and humanitarian work. For a while, it looked like Denver had finally found another chance at happiness. But once again, the relationship burned hot and fast. The couple separated in 1991 and finalized their divorce in 1993. The exact reasons behind the breakup remain unclear, but Denver later expressed plenty of frustration about how the relationship ended. He felt that Delaney had embarrassed him repeatedly during their time together. By this point, Denver had experienced enough heartbreak to know that fame, money, and success couldn't guarantee a happy personal life. And unfortunately, his story still wasn't finished. John Denver was living a double life for 28 years. Now we finally know why. After his marriage to Cassandra, Delaney ended. John Denver's personal life began unraveling in ways that were becoming impossible to keep out of the public eye. It started in 1993 when police stopped Denver for driving under the influence. At the time, he received a relatively light punishment and was placed on probation. It could have been the moment that forced him to change course. But less than a year later, Denver was back in trouble. He crashed his Porsche into a tree in his hometown of Aspen. When authorities investigated, they found that he had again been driving while intoxicated. This time, the consequences were more serious. Denver had violated his probation, sending him back into the legal system. The case eventually ended with a deadlocked jury, meaning a retrial would be needed. But there was one consequence he couldn't simply walk away from. The Federal Aviation Administration suspended Denver's flying privileges and required him to demonstrate long-term sobriety before he could legally fly again. He never got the chance to do that. In October 1997, Denver took off alone in a small experimental aircraft he had recently purchased. There was no question that he knew how to fly. He had been flying for years and had learned from his father, a highly accomplished Air Force pilot. Denver was an experienced aviator, but experience with flying didn't necessarily mean experience with that particular airplane. He had owned the aircraft for only about 2 weeks, and the plane had some unusual modifications that would later become a major part of the investigation. The biggest problem was the fuel selector. The handle used to switch between the aircraft's fuel tanks had been placed behind Denver's right shoulder. To reach it, he had to unbuckle his seat belt and twist around in his seat. That was an awkward and potentially dangerous position to be in while flying. Even more troubling, Denver had reportedly raised concerns about the location of the fuel selector with a technician shortly before taking off. There was another problem. Before heading out over Monterey Bay, Denver had already spent a significant amount of fuel practicing takeoffs and landings. At some point during the flight, he would need to switch fuel tanks. That was likely when everything went wrong. Despite having his flying privileges suspended by the FAA the previous year, Denver took the aircraft into the air for what appeared to be a routine flight. He never came back. The plane crashed into Monterey Bay, California. Rescue crews eventually recovered the wreckage, but Denver was killed in the impact. Because of his previous DUI arrests, one question immediately followed the crash. Had alcohol or drugs played a role? Denver had been open about his past substance use. In his autobiography, he discussed his experiences with marijuana, LSD, and cocaine. He had also been arrested twice for driving under the influence. Even an FBI file opened because of his anti-war activism mentioned his cocaine use. For some people, those details became an easy explanation for his death. But the evidence told a different story. Toxicology testing found no alcohol or drugs in Denver's system at the time of the crash. His past substance use had nothing to do with what happened that day. Instead, investigators focused on the aircraft and Denver's actions inside the cockpit. According to the National Transportation Safety Board's findings, Denver had told air traffic control shortly before the crash that he planned to remain in the air for another hour. Investigators believed he then reached behind himself to switch fuel tanks. As he twisted around, his body may have pushed against the aircraft's controls. The plane suddenly entered a steep maneuver that Denver could not recover from. His limited familiarity with the aircraft may have made the situation even more difficult to control. The crash was ultimately attributed to pilot error. Recovery crews later found the engine in about 40 feet of water. Denver had suffered fatal blunt force trauma, and because traditional identification methods were not possible, authorities used his fingerprints to confirm his identity. Today, a permanent memorial marks the crash site, where fans continue to remember the singer. But Denver left behind more than tragedy. In the years after his death, another side of his personality slowly came into view. He had always been open about his love of nature, flying, music, and even painting. But there was one passion he had largely kept to himself: photography. The public didn't fully discover that side of Denver until 2014, when an exhibition featuring his previously unseen photographs opened and offered fans a completely different look at the man behind the music. Still, it was his songs that ultimately became his lasting legacy. Denver's life was cut short, but his music never disappeared. Songs like Take Me Home, Country Roads, and Rocky Mountain High became far bigger than simple hits. Both were eventually adopted as official state songs, giving Denver a rare place in American music history. He remains the only musical artist whose songs have been officially adopted as state songs by more than one state. And in the end, that may be the clearest measure of John Denver's legacy. The man himself is gone, but every time those songs play, his voice still brings people back to the mountains, the open road, and a simpler America that he spent his life trying to capture.